Thanks everyone for joining. We'll just give everyone a moment to join and we'll get started in just a minute. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll get started in just a couple of seconds. We're waiting for everyone to join. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I see some people are still slowly trickling in, but we'll get started and then they can kind of come in during the introduction. So good afternoon. I think we have a really exciting discussion planned for today all around plant proteins in food. And this is brought to us by the British section of IFT. IFT being the Institute of Food Technologists. IFT is a nonprofit scientific society which functions as a forum for both students and food professionals to collaborate, learn around all the aspects of the science of food. So the British section is just one of 53 different regional groups of IFT all over the world. So if you're interested in learning more about IFT or the British section, I have our website, Twitter, email listed above, and we'd love for you to join. So today's section or session will be moderated by Stacey Pyatt. Stacey is a program manager for Proteins for Life at Wageningen University. And in that role, she's really focused on aligning protein-related research for all of the different stakeholders. She's also finishing up a 3-year position on the IFT Board of Directors. And she's also a founding member of the IFT Protein Division. So I'll turn it over to her in just a second, but I wanted to provide an overview of what we'll be going through today. First, we'll be talking about an overview of consumer drivers for plant-based foods, and Ian will talk us through that. Then we'll have an overview of protein functionality, where Laurice will take the role of that. And then we'll break out into 3 different shorter 5-minute speakers, and they'll be taking us through a number of new plant proteins that are up and coming. So over to you, Stacey.
Thanks for the introduction, Kelsey, and thank you for the invitation to moderate this session. It's a pleasure, and I'm really excited about the great turnout that we have and about the amazing speakers we have lined up. Just a little housekeeping for everybody. Please keep yourselves on mute. I don't hear any background noise, so I think that's already happening. And as already mentioned in the chat, please put your questions into the chat or in Q&A. You can submit those anytime. The chat is being monitored and we'll pick out some to answer. We're not going to unmute and get questions. Just with the number of participants and the limited time we have, it's better for us to kind of filter them in the chat and prioritize them and direct them to our speakers. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ian Carroll. Ian is Senior Strategic Marketing Manager of Plant-Based Foods at Kerry, which I'm sure you all know, a major company in the food and ingredients domain. Ian has a background in consumer and marketing within both business to business and fast-moving consumer goods. He's responsible for developing the deep understanding of consumers and the category dynamics that is available within Kerry, and it's very exciting to have him talk to us about the consumer drivers for plant-based foods, and in particular comparing North America to Europe, where there are some really interesting differences and important for everyone active in this field. So Ian, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Stacey, and good afternoon, everyone. Stacey, you might just confirm you can see my screen?
Looks perfect to me.
Great, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I think plant protein is a very exciting and important area. And I think we've got to the stage now, there's scientific consensus that if we maintain a status quo on our food supply chain, we simply won't be able to meet the needs of a growing global population without destroying the planet. So plant protein has an extremely important role to play in servicing that growing population and bringing diversity and sustainability to our food supply chain. But to make the changes required that we need to have a successful future, we need to start with the consumer, because it's the individual choices at consumer level that will ladder up into better choices at societal and at global level. So as Stacey said, today I'd like to present some key findings from some proprietary consumer research that we've carried out in Kerry. And the research has been based in both North America and Europe. So in total, we've got the opinions of over 7,000 plant-based consumers. And it's given us a real insight into what the drivers are and the barriers are within the plant-based category. So what are the key findings from the research? Well, I think number one is that this category is extremely dynamic. It's changing very quickly. Consumers' attitudes, needs, motivations are changing, and producers in the category are really finding it difficult to keep up with consumer needs. So the category is built on shifting sands. So it's important to keep a finger on the pulse of what the consumer needs are. So there's 4 key areas we've identified as being important in terms of developing a plant-based food that's going to meet the need of consumer. So the first one is taste. And when I talk about taste in this presentation, it's taste in the broadest sense. So it's the taste of the eating experience of the product. So it's taste, it's aroma, it's texture, it's mouthfeel. So it's making sure that a plant-based meat product is succulent and juicy, and a plant-based ice cream is sweet and creamy. So in general, taste was the #1 reason that consumers, or the #1 attribute for plant-based products when it comes to consumers. But they've identified it, it's actually the #1 area that needs to be improved with current market offerings. And it's also the #1 barrier that non-consumers of the category identify as the key reason why they don't buy into the category. So taste is really important. We've established that. But what's driving those taste expectations? Well, I think #1 is the fact that a lot of the growth in the category is coming from flexitarians. So flexitarians have a higher benchmark when it comes to taste because they also eat animal-based products. So unlike in the past when we had vegans and vegetarians driving growth in the category, they didn't really have that same benchmark. But now flexitarians eat across plant-based and animal-based. So that benchmark is so much higher when it comes to developing plant-based foods. The second area why taste is such a challenge is, I guess it's a very difficult and complex area from a food technology point of view. You're trying to take a soybean and turn it into something that looks and tastes like a beef burger. So it's a complex challenge. We're still relatively early in terms of the food technology and addressing those challenges. So it's unsurprising that we haven't quite got there yet. Then the third area is around, I guess, a lot of the early generation products failed to hit the mark when it came to taste. So consumers were left disappointed. So there's an added barrier then. If consumer has had a disappointing experience of a plant-based product in the past, they're going to be a bit more reluctant the second time around. So that's why taste continues to be a barrier. But it is an opportunity. There's emerging technologies taking place. Some of them we'll hear about later in the presentation from other speakers that can really develop the category and move it in line with consumer expectations. So the second area then we've identified through the research is health and nutrition. So one of the key reasons why consumers make a plant-based food choice is for reasons of personal health. They feel like if they eat plant-based foods, it's healthier for them. So that's a key motivation and a driver. But there is a bit of a contradiction in this area. Because taste is such a challenge, a lot of producers are using fat, sugar, salt to deliver against taste expectations. So you end up with a misalignment between taste and then nutritional content of the product. So I guess my message here is, yes, taste is number one, but a product cannot be developed that tastes well that does not deliver on health and nutritional expectations, because they are key reasons that consumers are trading into the plant-based category. The third area then is clean label. So clean label, I guess, is a phrase that's being used a lot by food producers at the moment. But what does it mean to the consumer? Well, it means a number of things. Number one is having shorter ingredient declarations. So again, because of the challenges of developing a tasty plant-based food, some products on the market have long ingredient declarations with unrecognizable ingredients. The consumer is becoming more savvy about this. They turn around the back of pack. They want to see ingredients that they recognized. They want to see ingredients closer to the source, covered ingredients where possible. And I think the media and social media has a role to play here as well, whereby there's been a lot of articles recently questioning how clean plant-based foods are. So I think there's an onus on the industry as a whole to develop products that are cleaner label that will meet the needs of the consumer. Then the final area is sustainability. So sustainability is obviously a hot topic across a number of different categories inside and outside of food, but it's particularly important for plant-based foods because the consumer is making a choice believing that plant-based foods are more sustainable, they're more environmental and more ethical. So the three key proteins that are used at the moment are soy, wheat and pea. They account for upwards of 90% of plant-based foods that are created at the moment. So soy has come under increasing scrutiny. I think there's been a lot of stories around deforestation in Brazil in particular. So from a consumer perspective, they need reassurance that the plant protein substrate that's being used in their product is, number one, it's deforestation free. Number two, it's GMO free. Number three, they want to get a sense of the carbon footprint of the product. And then number four, the water usage associated with it. So all in all, the consumer is becoming more savvy. So at the beginning of the plant-based boom, it was an equation between plant-based equals more sustainable. But now the consumer is starting to ask more questions. Is it more sustainable? What is the protein source used? What is the water content, the carbon footprint, etc.? So they would be the staple proteins that are used, but obviously there's a lot of exciting emerging proteins coming out. Again, some of the speakers later on this call will talk about them. Fava bean, quinoa, lentil. They're not so much in the consumer's consideration set currently, but they are definitely becoming more aware of more novel sources of protein. Then we get the further out proteins. So things like insect, algae, even air protein, they're probably a bit more on the cutting edge. They're probably less acceptable to the consumer currently because they simply don't know enough about them. But I think the research has shown us there's a simple equation at play. If a plant protein can taste the same or better than an animal-based product, and if it can cost the same or less, then the consumer will trade into the category. So I think we need to almost lose this idea of it's a plant-based food, therefore a compromise is made. I think the consumer will ultimately make the choice. I like this product. It tastes good. It's healthy. It's clean label. It's sustainable. It just happens to be a plant-based food. So moving on then to make that comparison between the US and Europe that Stacey spoke about a moment ago. So what are the key things we need to keep in mind when formulating food to win in plant-based? So number one, obviously, is meeting taste expectations. But like I said, it's not just about tasting as good or better than other plant-based foods. It's about tasting as good or better than animal-based because it's the flexitarian that's making the call. Then within meat alternatives in particular, I think whole muscle products are an interesting innovation and are the next frontier. So things like chicken breast, fillet steak, a roast joint of beef. So those kind of proteins to support those end format applications will become increasingly important to consumers. Like consumers have come into the meat alternative category through processed meat formats. So burgers, sausages, chicken nugget style formats. Now they're looking to take the next step. And it's those whole muscles that they're looking to move towards. So the second area then around nutrition and clean ingredients. So an important thing here will be protein content. So again, the consumer is becoming more savvy about level of protein in plant-based versus animal-based product. They don't want to be making a compromise, not only on protein content, but the bioavailability of that protein and the amino acid profile. So that's an important thing to consider in terms of delivering that nutrition, but also clean label ingredients. In terms of functional ingredients and good health, there's been a lot of media coverage around if I go plant-based, do I miss out on some of the key fats, minerals, vitamins that I need in my diet? So I think some plant-based categories are delivering upon the consumer need to have those additional functional ingredients within plant-based products. So thinking about things like B12, fats, omegas, particularly in the beverage space, we're seeing a lot of functional products emerge that the consumer is getting really excited about. I think it's fair to say that the US is a bit more developed in that area in terms of functional claims on packs and supplements. Europe is slightly behind, but certainly it's emerging and it's catching up quickly. Then the final area in terms of developing new foods is differentiating with sustainability. This is where we found another distinction between US and European consumers. So in general, European consumers valued sustainability on pack greater than US consumers did. And I think if you think of culturally why that may be the difference, I think US culturally is probably a bit more individual first, whereas Europe is a bit more society first. And that's reflected on the consumer need for sustainability in their food products. But having said that, with global climate change coming on the agenda so much more, with media coverage of all of that becoming so much more evident, I've no doubt that sustainability will grow in importance in the US into the future from a consumer perspective. So just to sum up in total, the key message from me, from the consumer's point of view, develop with taste as a priority, but taste alone will fail in this category if things like nutrition, health, clean label, and sustainability aren't considered. So that's all from me. Thank you. Stacey, I might hand that back over to you. And then obviously I'm happy to take any questions at the end in the Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much, Ian. I've seen a couple of questions coming through, and I think there's a lot to unpack in there. Looking forward to that discussion. But it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker in order to keep us a little bit on time. Our next speaker, Laurice Pouvreau, is a colleague of mine, has been a colleague of mine in a couple of different organizations for a number of years. Laurice is a senior scientist at Wageningen University Research. She is a protein chemist by training, originally from France, then got her PhD working on potato proteins, after which she's specialized in fractionation as well as application and structuring of plant-based proteins. Laurice, over to you.
Yes, I need to unmute myself first. It would work better.
It does help, yeah.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
I see it perfectly, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So as mentioned by Stacey, today I will talk about the challenges that you can face while you want to structure plant protein towards plant-based food. And I will mainly touch upon dairy and meat analog in this presentation, if I can change of slide. When you are actually thinking of developing a new food product, what you need first to think is which kind of ingredient or which kind of functionality my ingredients needs to have. And not all protein will be equally good for the type of application. So for example, if you are thinking of developing a beverage type of product, you need to have a protein ingredient which will have a high solubility to be able to not have sedimentation or phase separation upon storage. If you are talking about curd, cheese, yogurt, that type of application, you want to have a plant protein which is able to aggregate and form a gel, which really is the main structure which will give you the mouthfeel that you require in this type of product. On the other hand, if you are looking to make a meat analog in extrusion or other technology, you don't necessarily need an ingredient which will have a high solubility. It's actually sometimes a disadvantage in the extruder, for example. So you are more looking for a protein which is able to reshuffle upon high pressure, high heat, and form this disulfide bridge, which will give you the right structure desired. So again, the message here is not every ingredient will work for every type of application, but depending on the functionality, you can find application for these ingredients by understanding its functionality. When you are looking at plant-based dairy alternative, there is several functionalities that your protein need to possess. As I mentioned, the solubility is very important. As you can imagine, if you have a protein ingredient which is low in solubility, it might feel a little bit grainy or a bit dry while consuming, which is not what you desire. Of course, all these products contain fat. So you need to have a protein ingredient which is able to stabilize this fat droplet or this fat into the food matrix. When talking about a plant-based beverage, a pasteurization or a sterilization step needs to be applied at the end of the process for the shelf life stability. So you want to have an ingredient which is not going to aggregate sediment after the heat treatment to be able to have a product which is acceptable for the consumer. For the yogurt and the cheese, and I will go further in details in this part, you need an ingredient which is able to gel, so to form a gel and to form a self-supporting gel which gives the structure of your food and the mouthfeel of your food while consuming it. But as you may all know, and as you have heard as well, plant protein offer some challenges to us. They are not easy to develop product with. And one of the reasons for that is that they tend to have lower gelling properties. And I'm talking mainly about the storage protein in this case, so soy, pea proteins. They have a lower gelling properties than animal protein in general. You can see here that the plant protein are on the bottom of the pyramid, so they form weak gel, while animal protein tend to be more on the top of the pyramid, so having a stiffer and stronger gel upon deformation. What we really strongly believe is that there is clean label solution for that, and I'm coming back to the comment of Ian before, clean labels is of concern to some of our consumers. So it's important to have shorter lists, but also ingredients that they are recognizing. But moreover, it's also important, for example, in cheese, that you have similar amount of protein than in the dairy type of cheese. And right now, this is definitely not the case in most of the product. What we really strongly believe is that there is ways, when you know the ingredient properties, to be able to create really true protein gels, so to not have to add starch or hydrocolloid to your system to actually get the textures that you are looking for. And one of the ways to look for that is by blending ingredients, so finding synergy between protein ingredient, or by using less refined ingredients, which can also offer some advantages in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of cost as well. This is just an example, and I'm not going to go in detail in this slide, but what I just really want to show in this one is that from the first picture you see on the left and the last picture on the right, which looks very similar, the composition in terms of protein is very different. One contains 30% of soy protein, the last one, sorry. But what I want to show with this one is that if you understand the ingredient, how they interact with each other, and how to process them together that you are able to recover this microstructure and have very similar textural properties as well in terms of mechanical behavior, but also in terms of juiciness, which is also very important upon consuming the final product. Coming to the meat analog, there is several points that needs our choice, which needs to be made during the process. So the choice of the protein ingredient is of course very crucial because it's really the bulk ingredient while making a plant-based meat. The type of processing, so which type of technology are you going to use? The type of post-processing. Post-processing is often forgotten, but it's really very important in terms of the consumer experience at home. So for that, I'm talking about the marination, which is very important for the juiciness and taste, but also the freezing and thawing, which in high moisture extrusion is still very important to get the final fiber structure. And of course, the taste, the texture, and the juiciness is the final proof. So how the consumer is going to react to this final product. Something that also Ian touched upon, this soybean, wheat, split yellow pea, and lupin are the 4 main ingredients used in plant-based meat, especially soybean and wheat, which are actually 70% of the total amount in our product. And we need more flexibilities. We need, in terms of ingredients, to also not rely on one type of ingredient in the market, and also to have more local ingredient in general from a sustainability point of view. When looking at technology towards plant-based meat, you can think of the very traditional mixing, forming, and combining ingredient, and you can think of a burger patty in this case. And in this product, the main protein ingredient will be a texturized vegetable protein, which is made by low moisture extrusion. You have, of course, the example of the fermentation or the use of microorganisms, and for that you can think of the mycoprotein used, for example, in corn product. And again, there you need a binding protein, and I think it's why the next speaker will talk about as well on these high gelling proteins, which are able to actually bind these different ingredients and give the final fibrous structure. High extrusion is one of the technology, and I will come back to this one later. At Wageningen University, we are also looking at other innovative technologies such as a shear cell technology and also 3D food printing to be able to make plant-based meat analog. High moisture extrusion, what the type of products that you obtain from this technology, you can think of chicken pieces, pork pieces, so more also whole cut meat type of product. As mentioned, soy and gluten are still the main ingredients used in this technology. When you are starting to work with extrusion, the extrusion conditions, so in terms of pressure, temperature, screw configuration, all these parameters are very crucial for the final product quality. And this is also depending on the type of ingredients that you are using. And the cooling die is also very important. This really is a part where the structures that you have formed in the cooking part is fixed. And also it prevents the expansion of the material to get a more firm structure. And as mentioned before, the post-processing steps are also very crucial for the final product quality. It is a technology which is relatively widely used in industry, but what we have seen is that the upscaling capacity of extrusion is relatively limited. So we need also other way to structure proteins to be able to reach a broader range of consumer, but also to make this product more affordable for all. We do have a consortia working on this topic, which is called Plant Promise. What what we focus on here is really broadening the type of protein to be used in high moisture extraction, use of less refined ingredient, but also the main focus is on the product quality in terms of texture and taste and juiciness. This brings me to my last slide. We really need this protein transition towards more plant protein from a sustainability point of view, but also to be able to feed the world in the future. We need for a broader range of plant protein sources suitable for different applications. Again, I want to stress that not all proteins are suitable for all types of application. And what we also want to stress is that there is a need for integral approach of isolation, fractionation, and structuring to be able to use maybe less refined ingredients in the future to make better use of our crops, but also to make the product more affordable for the consumer. And it's an ongoing process. We know still very little about plant protein. There is a need for better understanding of protein functionality in food matrix, so in application. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurice. That was well on time, and I'm sure there were 100 more things you could say on each slide, but I saw a couple of questions that I think you're going to like answering in the chat. So with that, I'll move us right along, and it's my pleasure to introduce Marcel van der Vaart. Marcel is a business development manager at Cosun working on plant proteins. He's a molecular biologist by training and has 20 years of experience in food R&D, always with a focus on naturalness and sustainability. And he's working to set up the plant-based proteins business within Cosun, which is a very exciting development, and we're all looking forward to hearing a bit more about it.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks a lot for the nice words, and also, of course, for the invitation to say a little bit more about what we're doing at Cosun to build indeed a plant-based protein portfolio. Cosun is not so well known in the world as a name, so I have just two slides very quickly about who Cosun is. So maybe on the first slide, you can see a little bit about the size. That's the next one, sorry. I'm not doing, yeah. So actually Cosun is a corporation of 9,000 farmers. So we produce a lot of vegetables, and you see there's about 9 million tons of vegetables per year that we produce. And we have quite a number of processing facilities across Europe, but also in China and in the US. And on the next slide, you will see what our key sort of activities are, and maybe you recognize a few of them. We have Sensus making inulin, prebiotic fiber, Avico, known from the fries in the retail, but also business to business. We do a lot. SVZ, who's making all these nice fruit smoothies and juices. And if the Cosun Beet company, that's sort of the mother company who is producing the sugar, but nowadays also much more than only the sugar. And we have the Duinie Group, who is completely specialized in upcycling of rest streams. So the rest streams of Cosun itself, but also of outside Cosun. And they do that already for decades. So we were quite early in the thinking of upcycling and in the area of sustainability. And that helps us now greatly. So on the next slide, I will move a little bit into our protein portfolio. We looked at what for us are now the key drivers that we see in the market that are relevant for us, and also that we can play a role in and we can do something useful in. And we had sort of the natural label and neutral taste as sort of two of the key criteria that we saw. But besides that, also the local produce and sustainability. So there's big requests, especially in Europe, for local produce, but also sustainability, and mainly also in the area of sort of upcycling of rest streams. So don't use the main crop, but use a rest stream to make, for example, your ingredients. Now that put us into, we have three sort of pillars. Plant-based binding is one that we named. It's very much linked to the natural label. Mild tasting proteins, so well, the neutral taste, of course, and nutritional protein, where also the local producer sustainability come back. Okay, on the next slide, you will see what that means for us. So in plant-based binding, we work on leaf protein isolate. This is actually a protein that we isolate from the leaves of the sugar beets, which normally would remain on the land. But now we isolate the protein from there. And I will say a little bit more about that. In mild tasting, we focus on fava protein, so an isolate from fava beans, going into a very different segment. The first one goes more into meat replaces, bakery, and the second much more in dairy alternatives and other very mild applications. And on the right, and I will not talk about it now, but that is an activity where we work with brewer spent grain. So that's a leftover of the beer brewing industry. And we turn that into things like TVPs to make meat replacers. And that's a really nice example of upcycling of a rest stream and turning it into something very useful. Okay, the next slide. I go then a little bit more into the leaf protein isolate. And here we see, okay, within the leaves, the protein that's most dominant, and about 1% of the protein in the sugar beet leaf is an enzyme called rubisco. And rubisco is very important in the photosynthesis, so it is very conserved over all green plants, and actually it's the most abundant protein on earth because of that. And actually the rubisco protein is a very interesting protein because it has very strong gelation, foaming and emulsification properties, and also at very low quantities. So you can replace it, you can compare it with chicken egg white, and it has on a weight basis even a stronger activity than chicken egg white. So a very interesting one for the future, of course. Not easy. So on the next slide you see what we are doing. So we have our nice leaves from our crops, and on the bottom you see the demo facility that we have built. And in the demo facility we take out the rubisco from the chloroplast, actually in the which are in the plant. And the trick is there to separate the green part from the white part, and in the white part you can also find the rubisco. Not so easy, but we have a big program on that. And on the next slide you can see where we are. We are now, we are making the protein now, and we can make it at kilo scale at the moment. And we are doing application tests with it, and we can use it to replace, for example, chicken egg white in bakery applications. You see also meringue, but also the foaming comes, of course, in. And we also use it to replace, for example, methyl cellulose. So two big topics that are currently all around us: replacing methyl cellulose, replacing chicken egg white, and rubisco can certainly play a role in that. We have an EFSA procedure that has started, and trying to push this one really hard forward, but it's technological quite challenging project. Okay, the next. So the other one that I shortly want to touch upon is our fava isolate that we are working on. We saw that there were really difficulties in the marketplace with finding a protein that is so mild that you can apply it at reasonable quantities without really jeopardizing on the taste, or without needing to use for masking or the use for overdosing of other flavors to compensate for the sort of the negative flavor from the plant protein. So we developed another sort of process to isolate the protein from the fava bean, and ended up with a really clean powder. And you see some examples of real examples that we made. We made, for example, a yogurt has 6% protein, which is actually not possible at the moment. If you look in the retail, you will not see these type of products. But also ice cream at a 1% dosage, and a mayonnaise at a 1.5% dosage, and without the need for a lot of other flavors to sort of make the products nice and tasty. So the next slide, I think already one of my last slides. So we are now producing that, and this one is going quite fast. So we'll be commercial with this one Q2 next year. We're actually building the plant at this very moment in time, and we also don't need a regulatory approval, so we don't need to go through the EFSA process. So actually, in a nutshell, we are sort of building at this moment that plant protein portfolio. And we're very busy with it. We're not on the market yet, so we are much more focused on the current traditional products that we have from our business groups. But this is something to come in the near future, and we're planning to build that out and really quickly. And I think the questions, I had a question slide later, but I think these are for later. So we'll keep it to this. I think my 5 minutes are also passed.
I'm afraid so. But thank you very much, Marcel. Okay. I think there are some eager audience members probably ready to get their hands on some of your materials. So yeah. Stick around and we'll have that conversation in a minute. Akshay, I hope you're still here. If you would unmask yourself. Great, wonderful, great to have you. So our next speaker, Akshay Arora, he's a global technical manager of plant-based proteins at Ingredion, based in Bridgewater. And that is all he provided me for his introduction, which is very humble because I know that you have many, many years of deep protein expertise, not only in the B2B world, but also in consumer goods. So we're very excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Stacey, for the kind invitation and the introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good to me.
Thank you. So I will be talking about the pulse proteins. Just hang on. So with any plant-based protein, the first question that is typically need to be considered and answered is, what is its unique value proposition? What does it do in terms of solving a consumer problem or a customer problem? And I wanted to share 4 key metrics with you where pulse proteins are a very unique proteins in terms of solving customer problems, or their value propositions are around number 1, nutrition. If you look at pulses, they do have more than 20% protein, but in addition to protein, they also bring along fiber and some nutrients as well, which makes them a more of a holistic nutrition point of view, very compelling. Functionality wise, we know there are certain functionalities that we desire in dairy alternatives and meat alternatives, but pulse proteins have the capability to close some of that performance gap that we need in those leading applications. Most compelling of all the values is that pulses are non-GMO. None of the commercial crops that exist in the market today are genetically modified. And from the consumer point of view, they are also not a major allergen yet. So that does open up door for consumers who cannot consume soy or wheat as their primary plant-based proteins. And lastly, but not the least, from sustainability point of view, what's unique about pulses is they can fix nitrogen to the soil, so they can act as a fertilizer. They are a great source for rotational crops. So in between different crops, they can be planted, and they have very less carbon footprint. So from sustainability point of view, they do check off the box. So now we know what they are good for, but then the question is, how do we take the idea of pulses and take proteins from them and apply it to different applications or different needs? So there are different pulse-based protein ingredients that are available. They all do different things. It all starts with what is the consumer or customer need that we need to satisfy. So obviously at the very high end of the protein level, there are isolates. They have 80 to 85% protein. And they are usually good for going for protein forward applications where protein is front and center of the application. And in some cases, they are also the enabler of claims for different food ingredients. Concentrates have lesser protein content. They are somewhere in 50 to 60% range. But the beauty of those is from sustainability perspective, they are very compelling. Most of the concentrates are just made by dry milling of the seed itself. So there's not a lot of energy utilization, no water usage, and they are very low carbon footprint from that perspective. We think about plant sources from the crop itself, but we also need to think about once we take out the protein, how sustainable is that plant source? So concentrates are very compelling in that regard. Also, from consumer point of view, they are perceived as clean label, not chemical sounding, and they're very label friendly. Then there are flours as well. And then for the meat applications, there are texturized proteins available from the pulses nowadays. And although they are not identical to actual meat, but the gap is constantly being addressed in terms of improving their functionality or utilizing some additional components along with the texturized protein to deliver on taste, texture, and juiciness. So talking about those, if you can think of any application that protein needs to be used in, practically pulses can be used in several applications. But today, from the market point of view, definitely dairy alternatives and meat alternatives are top of the mind for consumer. And with pulse-based protein, we know there are some functionality gaps when it comes to comparison with animal-based protein, like milk-based proteins or animal-based proteins. So the understanding of functionality is usually the first point where it gives us the knowledge, what is the performance gap that we need to address, and then using a systems approach, for example, using the right amount of starch or using the right amount of hydrocolloid can help us in building that structure, or using some flavors can help us deliver on that taste component. So today, I think pulse proteins have come a long way in the last 10 years. Today, the gap, we are seeing that we're constantly closing the gap with the animal-based counterparts. Dairy alternatives, when it comes to those, Ready-to-drink products are, I think, the most ahead of all other dairy applications. But we are seeing really exciting developments in the area of making yogurts, for example, or cheeses. And I say that with a qualification. I know word cheese and yogurt may not be the right ones in certain geographies, but to make the point, I think they can deliver on those kind of food applications. Meat alternatives, I think we have seen several successful examples now where processed applications like burgers and patties and sausages, they have really hit the mark and closing the gap on taste, texture, and juiciness. And there's a significant and exciting development happening now in the area of whole muscle analogs or high moisture extrusion. So you will see more of those examples in the coming year. And when it comes to low moisture applications like bakery and snacks, I think that's where also understanding of the application needs, performance needs, it is possible to deliver on very good solutions for the customers. So with that, I'm going to pause and complete my section. I know I need to complete in 5 minutes. So Stacey, over to you.
Thanks so much, Akshay. Great talk. And I'm sure you'll be getting some more questions about those pulse proteins later on. Our next speaker, Marc Laus, is Technology Officer at the Potato Starch and Protein Cooperative Royal Avebe here in the Netherlands, where I'm also located. Marc has about 15 years experience in developing processes for the isolation of functional proteins. I think you were there at the very beginning for Avebe, and it's been an exciting time. I know you are basically global leader in potato proteins by now, with some very nice functional ingredients, and we're looking forward to hearing about them.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to tell something about the functionality of potato proteins. First, a brief introduction of our company. Avebe is a potato starch cooperative. We're located in the northern part of the Netherlands, like you said, and the northeastern part of Germany. And we process potato into potato starch and potato proteins. Potato starch we do for over 100 years. That's why we became royal a couple of years ago. And for potato proteins, we have developed 2 fractions that we currently put on the market for roughly 10 to 11 years now. And like Laurice explained, the functionality of a protein is largely determined by its solubility. And when you look at the potato, we separate the proteins in a potato into 2 specific fractions based on the molecular weight and the isolectic point of the protein. We have a Solenic 200 fraction, which has a very high solubility in the neutral pH range. And we have a Solenic 300 fraction, which has a very high solubility in the acidic pH range. And as such, the proteins are so soluble that they deliver transparent solutions that can be used in all kinds of food applications. A number of functionalities that these proteins have is, for instance, they have a very high foaming capacity. If you compare the overrun of these proteins to a number of other animal proteins in this case, then you can see that the foaming is slightly better than that of egg albumin and comparable to that of hydrolyzed whey. And typical applications that we see that our customers are using these proteins for are, for instance, the confectionery industry, where vegan marshmallows can be made from a combination of potato protein as a foaming ingredient and potato starch as a gelling ingredient. We also have these foamed gelled confectionery, foamed wine gum type of products, but also meringues and macarons are produced with our proteins. Another functionality that our protein gives is it has a very high emulsifying capacity. Especially the Solenic 300 fraction has an emulsifying capacity that's similar to sodium caseinate, and therefore we see that our protein is often used in applications like spreadable plant-based cheese, but also block cheese, sliced cheese, but also more the the sauces like mayonnaise, and there are a number of products on the market where egg white is being replaced as an emulsifying component in mayonnaise, for instance. We also have assessed the gel strength comparison, and especially looking at the neutral pH range, our Solenic 200 has a higher gel strength as comparable or slightly higher than that of egg albumin. And we see typical applications that have our proteins are plant-based meat, both pre-cooked as raw meat analogues, but also similar applications like filet américain or plant-based meatballs and stuff like that. So that's it. We see potato protein similar as a functionality of, for instance, egg. And if you would like to have more information, please visit our website.
Love that picture. Thanks, Marc. So with that, it wraps up the presentations, and I'd like to invite all of the speakers to turn their videos back on, and we'll go ahead and take some questions and have a little discussion. The first question I wanted to pose was to Ian. I saw that you've also you've answered it in the Q&A, but I thought it was a really interesting question, and one that I think the listeners would also appreciate hearing. And it goes into the individual differences within consumers and how the sort of types of consumers fall, and how those different drivers that you mentioned sort of relate to different consumer groups. I wonder if you could answer that for us, for the group again in the discussion.
Yeah, sure. And it was a great question, and it was actually formed the main part of our research brief. So if you see the full research report, we have a consumer segmentation analysis in there. And basically what we've identified, there are 4 separate consumer groups underneath flexitarian that have different drivers. Like we've identified them, number 1, natural nutrition seekers. So these are people that are looking for cleaner label products. They're looking for turning over back a pack. They want to deliver nutrition, but not with artificial additives. The second then group is what we call body performance optimizers. So in general, I think plant-based consumers are more active outdoors, more sporty. They're looking for food as fuel. Body performance optimizers are all about protein content, macronutrient content, and using food to fuel performance. Then the other 2 are just lifestyle embracers and eco-ethicals. So they're more around the kind of the social emotional drivers. So it's about how sustainability feeds into their lifestyle, how they can save the planet, how they can identify through social media with other people that share the same values. So I actually popped the link into the Q&A chat. We have an ebook that can be downloaded that goes through a bit more information on those 4 consumer segments.
Fantastic. I'm sure you'll get a lot of takers for that book. The second question, there are a few questions that go into a bit into different sort of product categories that I thought would be interesting for the group. And I'm guessing I can target this first one toward Marc. It's about the plant-based sport foods category and what kind of movements you're seeing and what kind of movements you're expecting in that plant-based sports foods category.
I think, especially looking at plant-based sport food, it's nutrition, texture, and taste. What you see is that currently there are not many plant-based protein that deliver the similar amino acid and digestibility compared to animal proteins. So I think that's a challenge. However, with protein consumption being at a certain level which exceeds the minimum required intake, I think even plant proteins can deliver a good functionality there.
Perfect, thanks. Akshay, can I ask you to speak to the plant-based dairy, and in particular in the category of ice cream? What kind of developments are you seeing and expecting, and how do your ingredients in the portfolio perform in the ice cream in specific?
Great question. this is the one category that I have personally dealt the least with. So I'm honestly may not be the most qualified person to answer in that area, but I know in general, so far in the dairy category, the major focus has been on the RTDs, ready to drink beverages, cheese and yogurts. And that in that area, we have done a lot of comprehensive work in terms of understanding not only the protein itself, but taking it through the operation, like starting with the hydration piece, starting with its gelling piece, denaturation piece. How does it forms different textures and stability throughout the shelf life within those categories? That I can tell you, we have done a lot of work, and now we understand a little bit better how it works. Ice cream, I honestly am not that familiar with.
Marcel, you showed an example of an ice cream in your presentation. Do you want to talk about the particular challenges you encountered in making that? I know it's a really hard product to make.
Yeah, well, actually, of course, you need to make the emulsion, and in your overrun, you need to get air into the product. So you need to really have a good emulsifier, and that can enables that. So you need to have a protein that is very well soluble, also to make that happen. And I think if you look at, we talk with a lot of customers, and they all come back with the same, and that is taste. So they all have problems formulating plant proteins because there comes a beanie note or there comes another note up that they then need to mask again, often with, for example, very expensive vanilla flavor or with maskers. So I think the key challenge is flavor for that segment.
Thanks. Yeah, I personally do always appreciate my ice cream to taste really great. So I'm on board with that.
Yeah.
Laurice, there are a number of questions asking for comparisons between different categories of proteins, and if I'm going to sort of lump a couple of questions together and toss them to you. So can you compare a little bit between the more established plant proteins and fungi-based proteins or microalgae proteins and proteins from oil seeds? So where are you seeing those in terms of maturity and also in terms of functional performance? Which ones do you think are interesting and will emerge in the coming years? Sorry, that's a very complicated question.
It's a very broad question that you're asking me, sir. I think they have very different level of readiness. So if you are talking about the oil seed, you can think of soy and canola rapeseed. Soy is, of course, the reference in a way in terms of plant protein. But rapeseed and canola, I think there is a lot of development, and I think they are getting there in terms of functionality. In terms of taste, I'm not completely sure yet. I honestly did not taste myself a rapeseed or canola ingredient, but I think the taste might be the most challenging part there, but they seem to be quite functional. Looking at the fungi, so mycoprotein, they are already applied in like corn in terms of, and there is other company producing mycoprotein also coming up. So I think I see great potential for this one in terms of volume you can produce. But we still need to learn a lot on them, on how to get structure out of it. Because we have the process that corn is using, but it's still a relatively expensive process. So how can you make it also more easy accessible and to have a broader range of product with this type of protein? The microalgae, it's still, for me, in its infancy. It's microalgae by itself can be used in some meat analog, for example, but the color and the taste will still be an issue. And the accessibility of the protein towards digestibility, so the nutritional value is quite challenging as well there.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that comprehensive answer to my very complicated question. We are at the time originally planned for this webinar. So those of you who have a strict deadline or who have a hard stop, we thank you very much for being here, and you're of course welcome to hop off. Our speakers did indicate that they were able to hang out for another 10 minutes and answer a few more of the great questions that you all have provided. So if you're able to hang with us, please do so. We'll just highlight a couple more of these, and we'll aim to round up at about 10 past the hour. So the next question that I picked out was actually a little bit related to what Laurice answered, and Ian, maybe a bit more directed at you. How are you seeing the consumers perceiving some of those wild or new proteins? You did touch on them, the microalgae, the fungi, the bacterial sources. What kind of responses are you getting there, and do you expect that those are going to be accepted in the short or medium term?
Sure, yeah, good question. So I guess the simple answer is that don't overestimate how much the consumer knows. That they know it's plant-based, they know about soy, they know about wheat, they read about some of these other things in the media, but honestly, at this stage, like, they don't have any understanding around like performance of these products or how they fit into their diet. So, but the key thing about this category, it's so dynamic and it changes quickly. So what's true today of the consumer that has probably a fairly basic understanding of protein substrates, that can change very quickly. And I think the driver of change will be what I mentioned. Number one, does it taste good? Number two, how does it perform nutritionally? And number three, cost-wise. So I think we're still at the stage where plant proteins are comparatively more expensive than the animal-based versions. But as companies scale up production, as consumer acceptance of products becomes better, that cost will come down. And I think then consumers will become more aware of these more innovative proteins.
Thanks. Great answer. Akshay, there was a very specific question to you that I think is interesting and hints at how you're approaching things in a unique and unusual way. You mentioned, or you touched on, using the systems approach. Can you explain what you mean by that and how you work with that?
Let me contextualize it this way. If we think about performance of a protein and which protein gives that performance, so let's say the performance scale is 1 to 100, and maybe dairy and other animal proteins are almost 100 in that performance scale. Maybe soy comes to 90 plus on that performance scale. Some of the newer plant proteins, which we are learning more about, maybe they are 60% of the way there. So the question is, how do you make up that 40% gap? An example of that would be, if you look at pulse proteins, most commercial pulse proteins have a solubility at neutral pH around 20 to 30% range. So let's say if you're adding 100 grams of protein in water, maybe 20 to 30 grams will solubilize, 70 will just sit down, settle at the bottom. So systems approach is understanding what can I do to keep the remaining 70% in the water. So simple ideas like using starch as a thickener, this is just an example, can help you keep that rest of the 70% in the water, or even better, if there are better hydrocolloids with cleaner label, they can be at a smaller level and so on. So similarly, for that's an example just from the solubility perspective, but what as food scientists, what we need to do is take any given application, be it ice cream or be it a meat analog or such. You have to then go step by step. What do we need to deliver for performance in those applications? Where are the gaps? Then we can use non-protein components like hydrocolloids, fibers, starches, fats, in some cases flavors and micronutrients to help overcome that kind of a gap. Another example from systems approach would be on the flavor side. We know several plant proteins are not as bland as what we see on the animal side, right? So what can be done there? And I think now the flavor science has advanced so much. Combination of maskers, FMPs, and congruent flavors can help us bridge that gap or minimize some of those off notes. So system approach means is thinking about non-protein pieces to give you that performance in taste, texture, and appearance, those kind of things.
Yeah, brilliant. And so important to think holistically when you're formulating the products. I love that. So there are a number of questions related to meat analogs, and I thought maybe I'm going to sort of do a little round of some of the panelists and ask the questions for those. Laurice, maybe you can kick it off by explaining the multiple functionalities that proteins are performing in meat analogues, and then we'll go around to the ingredient companies to get an insight into how their portfolio are filling those gaps.
Yeah, I can try at least. It really depends from the type of meat analog you are talking about. So if you are talking about the chicken pieces, it's mainly the bulk protein which will form the structure of so the fibrous type of structure that you required. If you are talking about a burger, for example, or a patty, you need the texturized vegetable protein, but you also need a binding protein. And this is where Marc and Marcel can play a role with their protein, at least with some of their protein. So it's really, gelling are binding properties, but the network formation towards fibrous structure.
Perfect. That's exactly what I hoped you would kind of cue up to contextualize. Marcel, do you want to jump in there and explain how your portfolio of proteins that you're working on addresses those needs?
Yeah, so of course we work on the, let's say, the Rubisco protein that we talked about, and that is clearly an example of a protein that is capable of making a gel network in, for example, a burger, and that sticks together the TVP particles. And so, and that is also the function of the protein in it is that if you look at, for example, the TVPs that we make with the brewer's pen grain, they have, of course, nutritional value because the proteins are in there, but besides that, also the textural element and also the chewiness that you can feel between your teeth. There's, in the binding system, there's many different roles and functions that have to be played. So I think with the gelling proteins, it's more the sticking it together, making sure it doesn't fall apart and it becomes firm, and you get a bit of a bite. And the other one, the TVPs, is more about the chewiness that you introduce with these ingredients.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much. Akshay, do you want to talk through the meat analogues functionality you're delivering with the pulses?
Yeah, I want to touch on two areas. One is definitely in meat analogues. Number one thing we need to deliver is texture. So the texturizing solutions are available as texturized protein itself, whether it's a dry or the high moisture one. So that's one. Other area is you have to think about, you go through an extruder, you create that high moisture chicken-like fibrous texture, but then how do you convert it into a pork-like taste or a chicken nugget-like final performance? So you do need secondary application systems to get you to the final endpoint. So what historically Ingredion has done, we have a lot of knowledge and solutions in the area of batters and breadings in terms of marinades to take it to the final endpoint where it then eventually becomes a pork-like, chicken-like, or maybe beef-like.
Great, thanks so much. Marc?
Yeah, I think it's similar, like already explained there, at least with our potato proteins. What we do is we can replace egg white. Egg white was generally used as a binder. Also, methyl cellulose is currently used a lot, which can be replaced. And next to that, we have a wide range of starches that are used as for instance, a juiciness enhancer, but also potato fiber, which has a very high water binding capacity, is used in these kind of applications as a juiciness enhancer. So there are multiple options, and either whether it's TVP based or fungal biomass based, these can be formed together with at least a number of the solutions that we have.
Oh gosh, that's a conversation that could take us another hour, is starting to dive into the interesting synergies we could get from all of your ingredients. Maybe that's a topic for a next webinar.
Yeah, maybe to tap into it. I think it looks like we are doing sort of exactly the same, together with Avebe, and we have a protein that can gel. But I can tell you, the gel is very different. So, and I think combining could really be a nice and interesting option. But that's maybe for another discussion. Yeah.
More than welcome to receive material, guys.
Yeah. Very good.
All right. So Laurice will do some experiments and we'll hear about them in the next webinar. Yeah. Great. Well, I see that it is 10 after the hour, and I promised that we would wrap up. I know there are a lot of great questions that we didn't get to, but if you have a burning question that we weren't able to answer, I think, funnel it through the IFT British Section organization. I'm sure they're happy to bring you in touch with any of the speakers. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and I'd like to thank our speakers and panelists so much, and especially the IFT British Section organizers for setting up this event and facilitating it all. So thanks everybody, wishing you a nice afternoon, a nice evening, a nice day, depending on where you are, and see you next time.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Stacey.
guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.